he decided to toast this historic moment, as he sees it, in the realignment of the British right with a glass of champagne.
Following his dramatic sacking via social media yesterday morning, Jenrick appeared on stage with Reform leader Nigel Farage to announce that he was joining the party.
I can't kid myself anymore. The party hasn't changed, and it won't. The bulk of the party don't get it. They don't have the stomach for the radical change that Britain needs.
Well, Patrick, you've got a wonderful column in the Times today painting a vivid picture because you got up in the early hours to travel up to Dundee with Nigel Farage and then travel back down for this defection. Give us a little picture of how it all unfolded.
Yeah, well, when I got on a small jet with Nigel Farage at 7 a.m. yesterday, struggling through the aforementioned cold you and listeners will probably be able to hear, I did wonder how exciting the day was going to be. We were flying to Dundee and I thought, well, I'll have an interesting conversation about Scottish politics with Nigel Farage and get a sense of just where reforms, quite surprising support given his history in Scotland, is coming from. But I was sat in a hotel deep in Fife just after 11 a.m. Nigel Farage had got onto the stage of a hotel bar to welcome Lord Offord, another Tory defector, as Reform Scottish leader, when everybody's phones among the assembled hacks beside me started exploding, and Kemi Badenoch had sacked Robert Jenrick. And then I immediately knew, once the pleasantries had concluded between Farage and Reform's new Scottish leader had concluded, that literally everybody in the room, he was due to take 23 questions. I knew at least 3/4 of those would be about Robert Jenrick, and so it proved. And early on in that press conference, Nigel Farage was handed a sheet of paper by an aide which said, Kemi has just sacked Robert Jenrick, and had to maintain a poker face, and then decided not to lie. He said, yes, I've been talking to Robert Jenrick. He denied that any imminent deal to secure his defection had been agreed. He then went backstage. I was backstage with him. And he sort of widened his eyes, shrugged his shoulders and said, Kemi has put 2 and 2 together and made 5. And then a few minutes later, he made good on a promise he made on stage. He got back in the people carrier that was transporting his party, in which I was embedded, around Fife, and gave Robert Jenrick a call. And at that point, the defection was all but agreed. And we headed back to Dundee Airport, got on a plane, and he decided to toast this historic moment, as he sees it, in the realignment of the British right with a glass of champagne.
Yeah, pretty incredible. And of course, people are having lots of fun with the fact that this is a cynical career move by Robert Jenrick, particularly fueled by the fact that Robert Jenrick and Nigel Farage have said quite a few nasty things about each other. This is Jenrick speaking to The Sun as recently as September.
And on that note,
I don't think Nigel is the bloke that you want to have running your kids' schools or running your local hospital, or as the public finances continue to collapse under Rachel Reeves, trust your savings, your pension, your small business too. I'm not sure if Nigel actually thinks he's the right person to do that himself.
Mind you, criticising Nigel Farage for not being able to run schools rings even more hollow when we had the farce of Robert Jenrick getting lost on the way to his own defection press conference. Let's hear Nigel Farage.
And on that note, I will welcome Robert Jenrick into this room and into Reform UK. Oh, he hasn't changed his mind, has he? We can't find him.
Well, there you go. I mean, I guess the immediate thought is everyone but Robert Jenrick, it seems, knew that he would eventually defect to Reform. It's interesting that he didn't even temper his columns. In fact, in a text exchange with a journalist on Friday, he was still adamant that he wasn't going to defect, Patrick.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I struggle to get too excited about journalists being lied to in private conversations by politicians. I mean, if I got outraged publicly every time that had happened to me, my cardiovascular health would be even worse than it already is. So, you know, that is par for the course, particularly when someone is embarked on a pretty I would say explosive move as Robert Jenrick has been, and also, by the way, from my long conversations with Nigel Farage yesterday, I think it is true that neither Robert Jenrick nor Nigel Farage had fully decided what was going to happen. Even as late as sort of 5 to 11 yesterday. I mean, their conversations have been going on directly since December. From September to December, they were taking place through an intermediary, Tim Montgomery, the former Times journalist and advisor to Boris Johnson, who listeners to this station will know from his own regular appearances. He's now a member of Reform. But the serious conversations between the two men directly had only been taking place for 2 weeks. And in the sort of chaotic and tense moments after Nigel Farage's press conference, what his aides were saying to me was, look, we thought this was maybe going to happen in April, in May, probably, if he'd asked us to put money on it, after the May elections. And their view very quickly became one of cautious optimism, I would say. And the reason they're optimistic is because they think Kemi Badenoch has accelerated a reckoning that was already happening on the right of British politics. They thought that they needed proof of concept on the 7th of May, on the 8th of May, when it's overwhelmingly likely, if you look at the polls and by-election results, that the Tories will at the very least be all but wiped out in Wales and Scotland and will lose quite heavily in England, right? That is just a psephological fact at this point. After which they thought, well, look, at that point, we will have electoral proof that we have supplanted the Tories as the main party on the British right. And remember, by the way, before we get into conversations about what does it mean for Nigel Farage to be running for election in 2029 with lots of former Boris Johnson ministers, won't people think we kicked them out in the first place? The point of this phase of Reform's existence is to replace the Conservative Party as the main party on the right of British politics, to establish itself as the main challenger to Labour under first past the post. So what matters are the dynamics within the right bloc of the British electorate and British activists and British parliamentarians. And so that's why the Reform view is, look, you've just accelerated a conversation that was already happening within the four walls of right-wing politics in Britain, which is the party, who is the leader, and their view is, those voters, Tory voters from 2024 who didn't back Reform, those who haven't yet switched. Yes, not all of them are going to come over. Not every Tory MP is going to come over. Indeed, in the immediate term, everybody on Robert Jenrick's wing of the Tory party is professing loyalty to Kemi Badenoch. And their view is this forces people to have that discussion much sooner than it would otherwise have happened. And indeed, Farage spontaneously and instinctively said, when he was asked about this in Scotland for the first time yesterday, and then repeated it even more bluntly when he returned to London and unveiled Jenrick, was, OK, if Robert Jenrick and others want to have this conversation now, we've got to have it before the local elections. We've got to have it before the 7th of May. You have to leave the Tories before the local elections.
Let's talk about the impact of Robert Jenrick's defection on the Labour Party. Work and Pension Secretary Pat McFadden spoke to Chloe Tilley and Callum MacDonald on Times Radio Breakfast.
I don't think what we've seen in the last few days is evidence of the right starting to unite. On the contrary, I think it's evidence that we're seeing more of the same chaos and drama that's been happening on the right, which so dominated our politics during the 14 years of the Conservatives' period in power. The only difference this time is that it's being played out over two parties and not one.
You said before the break, Patrick, that this is a battle for the Tory right, and I completely agree with you. So in some ways, it's a blessing for the Labour Party to watch this effectively Tory civil war play out. I mean, it can't be anything but good news for Labour in what is otherwise a very bleak scenario.
Yeah, look, I think I agree with both James Johnson and Pat McFadden. James Johnson pointed out that a very small number, comparatively, of Labour voters are considering voting Reform compared to 20% of Tory voters. This is what Robert Jenrick's defection and...
That is the key stat for me. Absolutely crucial.
Exactly. And I think what we're going to see at the next election, and this will be the dynamic that defines the next Labour leadership election when that comes, be it in the next couple of weeks, be it in May, be it next year or in 2028, is who can unite the left bloc of British politics in the most electorally efficient way to take on a divided right bloc, or maybe then a right bloc that's divided less profoundly. But if you agree, and it's possible to agree, by the way, that Kemi Badenoch has played the tactics of this right and has united what's left of the Conservative Party behind her and has made further defections less likely. If the Labour Party is facing a divided Conservative bloc with Reform and the Tories scrapping for the same pool of voters, that's not to say that's the same anywhere. Reform does attract a smaller but not insignificant number of former Labour voters, right? If the Tories and Reform are still duking it out on the right of British politics, and there is a Labour leader who can say to the public, to voters on the Liberal left, do you really want Nigel Farage as Prime Minister heading up the remnants of Boris Johnson's cabinet? I think even for unpopular Labour government, that is a reasonably effective message. It's probably the least worst message you can take to your bit of the electorate if your sole objective is how do we stop Nigel Farage getting into power. Now, that assumes lots of things. It assumes that Labour's record in government hasn't got worse. It's assumed that Green voters are interested in coming back to the Labour Party. And I think that's a big, big question. And Labour people often take that for granted when I think there's mounting evidence that lots of those Green voters are not necessarily interested in voting for the Labour Party. But yeah, I think I wouldn't necessarily say it's straightforwardly good news for the Labour Party, but it's certainly not bad news that the divisions on the right are looking to be entrenched. Now, if, by the way, Nigel Farage follows this through to its logical conclusion and Tories, both in the country and in Parliament, follow Robert Jenrick's lead to the extent that the Tories become a sort of statistical insignificance and they really become the predominant party on the right, and Toryism is a minority pursuit at the ballot box, by which I mean, they're bouncing around on 10% by 2029. As they already are in Wales and Scotland. Look, in Caerphilly, they won 2% of the vote. Then I think all bets are off, and actually fragmentation on the left then becomes a much more important story.